ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hello and welcome back to Duran ASEAN. We're moving on to our ABC Dialogue and you're with Gowri and Arlene. Today we are talking to Dr. Johan Saravanamuttu, very interesting name, and he is a visiting senior research fellow from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. So, Doctor, you have done a lot of work researching in Southeast Asia. How did you move from the whole thing? Did it come a bit later, this whole religious diversity thing?
Yes, in fact, the religious pluralism, religious diversity issues of interfaith came along much later when I was working on Malaysian politics and relations between ethnic communities and so on in Malaysia. My own sort of original training was in political science, and my major sort of specialization was in international relations, actually. And I've written quite a lot of pieces on Malaysia's foreign policy and issues of international relations, integration, etc., trade, economic issues as well, for the region of Southeast Asia, and of course ASEAN comes into play there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For your upcoming seminar in the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia, which is based in Sunway University, you'll be speaking more on religious diversity and with a focus on pluralism. As we all know, the word pluralism is somehow a haram word, at least in the context of Malaysia.
Yes. After the was it a fatwa? Yeah, on sisters in Islam. Yeah, liberalism, pluralism. Yes, you mentioned the seminar at the Jeffrey Chia Institute. Yes, that's together with my colleague, also formerly at ISEAS. We wrote this book together, or rather edited the volume together. It's a very thick volume, as you can see in front of you, and many contributors. And it's on religious diversity stroke pluralism in two Muslim-dominant societies or countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. We didn't tackle Brunei not just because it's small, but there were not enough issues and people.
And you don't want to offend the monarchy.
Well, we try to be as critical as possible because there are issues every day that surface in both Indonesia and Malaysia, and interfaith issues have become, I think, very, very crucial or rather important for these two countries in terms of maintaining some level of social coherence, and it impacts on politics, it impacts on everything, it impacts on everyday life, as we all know in Malaysia. But fortunately, I think it hasn't reached a point in both these countries, which are democratic countries, and that's very important, or at least we have democratic systems. So that helps to alleviate many of these.
If you are measuring the system of elections, maybe.
I've been doing that electoral studies as well, yeah. So that's one of the, so it all comes into play, I think, But I think at bottom line, all of Southeast Asia is highly diverse. Mm-hmm. It's probably possibly one of the most diverse regions in the world. Yeah. If you look at all the influences that have affected Southeast Asia from time immemorial, just name it. All the world religions are here, and of course indigenous groups have their own religious practices. Name it: Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, Sikhism,
even
Islam, of course.
Judaism,
yes.
There are still minority pockets of
right.
the Jews. Gowri, we discussed a lot about ASEAN Summit and its challenges, its limitation. And one of the things that we actually realize is when it comes to addressing issues about religious diversity, especially when it comes to human rights violation, ASEAN is a bit lagging behind. Right, Gowri?
It is, especially if you look at countries like Myanmar. Earlier today, we saw a news where their president actually said that all these Rohingyas being tortured and all is just a media fabrication, which of course we know is not true because they are all over in Thailand, in Malaysia also. And that's not the right way to address an issue, just to in terms of covering up. And why is it so difficult for for them to actually come forward and come to terms with what they're facing?
Well, as an international relations specialist, I would say, personal studies international relations, I would say it's because of this notion of the nation state.
Okay.
I mean, in fact, the notion of the nation state itself is problematic because it comes from 1648, European notion of the Westphalian state. And that's the idea that you have actually one community, a homogeneous group that actually occupies a territorial area, and it's called a nation state. But as we all know, all countries in the world, all states in the world are plural. Even Japan, which is one of the most monocultural countries in the world, I think you all realize, but they have they have a Korean minority. They have increasingly migrant communities which have become, part and parcel of Japanese society. So I think the nation state has a way of, factoring out minorities, and that's one of the. I'm plugging my book now. One of the things that we are concerned about in the book is that you have this Muslim majority states, the two major ones. In fact, the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, has so many of these minorities, and there has to be some way of creating, a regime or rules and regulations and practices, best practices, which protect the minority rights. I think that's very important. Of course, the majority will always be.
It is the limitation of the nation states in Southeast Asia, or is it the limitation of nation state as in like the character system itself?
I think the big one is the generic problem of the nation state is one, which in a way has been overcome, say, in the European Union, where you have a supranational state. You have the European Union, so which is an amalgamation of many nation states. So they've created what are loosely called European values, including human rights.
So do you think that's the kind of direction that ASEAN should go, or at least look forward towards?
I think so, but it will take a very long time. I mean, because even within ASEAN, we need to look at the individual states and make their systems more robust in terms of handling some of these religious conflicts in particular.
Remember in the event that we attended last week, where there was a handover ceremony from Myanmar to Malaysia as the 2015 ASEAN chairman, and one of the speech by Datuk Sri Mustafa Muhammad he said that ASEAN will never be EU and never intended to be like EU, and he reads down why it is that so, and one of it that it never intend to create the kind of system, the supranational system that you mentioned earlier, like the EU. And do you think this is something that is a good choice for ASEAN leaders to do that?
It's a debate. I think most people, like you mentioned, point taken. Would argue that we are very different, for historically, etc., very different. ASEAN came together and has expanded over time because of interstate relations. So I mean, it's the conflicts that arose. It started, for example, when Malaysia and Indonesia had this major confrontation, or rather Indonesian confrontation against Malaysia in the 60s. That sort of provided spark. When it ended, it provided the spark for some kind of a better set of international relations among the ASEAN states. And of course, you had Vietnam, Laos, you had communism versus non-communism, and you had this Vietnam War and so on. Remember those days? Of course, you were not born yet. we on the other hand, my generation, we were very anti-war. We were very angry with what was happening. The Americans coming to Southeast Asia and creating havoc in this region. Anyway, all that ended by the late 70s. So by the end of the 60s actually, and then late 70s it became even better, and that's why you had the communist countries join ASEAN. So it's a very different scenario for ASEAN in terms of how it happened, and it will be a different scenario in the future as well. We can't quite be like the European Union, but I'm saying the aspiration to arrive at some level of integration, some level where you accept certain practices and norms, as basically universal, right? I mean, human rights, rights of women, rights of children, which is already accepted by individual countries. And I would say we should plug in this thing about religious freedom, religious rights, and interfaith relations, because we are actually a cauldron of all these different religions, and we would be a good example of how these things can be managed, and people can live in peaceful coexistence.
Is there any particular country where they have a solid framework for minority rights that we can take after?
Yeah. This whole minority rights actually has become. Yeah, I'll answer the question of the country later,
Okay.
but it harks back to a particular concept that was very popular, I think, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, multiculturalism. So many countries in the European and Western context. I will give one example, since you asked for a country. Canada. We talked about Toronto just now.
Yeah, we did.
A very cold country. So I lived in Canada. In fact, I did
Right.
my graduate studies in Vancouver. And then also later on went as a visiting professor to U of T, University of Toronto. Now, Canada has a practicing two policies. One is called biculturalism. So, as you know, Canada has a very strong presence of a French community in the state of Quebec. And so they're bicultural in that two official languages are recognized, English and French. And more recently, Canada has also introduced something called multiculturalism. In other words, it recognizes the existence of minorities.
Recently, as in...
I would say by the recently 70s, 80s, thereabouts. Yeah, not so recent, but they introduced that notion, and it's been in practice. And yet another very important thing which we forget often are the indigenous communities.
Right.
So Canada has something called First Nations.
Okay.
Some
Like the
people,
policy.
some people who don't think very hard call them Red Indians.
Right.
Is it similar to
Recently,
the
a gentleman.
Is it similar to the Bumiputra rights in Malaysia?
Similar, and yet not the same, because even in the Canadian case, as you know, because of colonialism and all that, the First Nations were very badly treated. I mean, massacres, you name it, in the U.S. as well. But increasingly, there was this recognition and of the fact that they were actually the first occupants, known occupants of what is now known as Canada. And in fact, Canada then created recently. This is in 2000 something. I can't
that's
remember.
recent.
Yeah. 2000, maybe even 2005 or 6. A state for the Inuit people,
Okay.
whom we know as Eskimos.
Yeah.
But Inuit people now have an autonomous state, which is, where they are able to, practice their rights, and they have a certain level of
And
freedom.
they have the right to kill certain animals that typical Canadians might not be able to do so.
Exactly. Oh, you've been following this very closely.
I've been watching a lot of documentaries, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then you have the people in Scandinavia, Sami, SAMI. They also become recognized by the Scandinavian countries as indigenous communities. They're the ones that kill the reindeer,
Right.
or rather, eat reindeer meat. That kind of thing, So there are all these interesting things that are going on. They're very small, minorities, which have, and they are the indigenous groups. We have plenty of indigenous groups of people who are now also, I think, fighting for minority rights.
Is there anything similar to those laws in any of the Asian or Southeast Asian countries?
Laws, Well, in Malaysia, actually, it's quite interesting. We have something called customary rights.
It's practiced in Sabah and Sarawak, right?
Sabah and Sarawak, and it relates to land matters. So, in theory, the Bidayus, the Ibans, the Penans, and the Kadasans and all, they have rights to land, which the state cannot alienate.
It's like the Malay reserve land.
Yes,
Would
similar.
that be the same?
Yeah. So in a way, Malays also in Peninsular Malaysia have made that kind of claim as indigenous peoples, but some people dispute the fact that Malays are truly indigenous, in the sense that they're also very culturally mixed. So over time, there's been a lot of intermarriage, cross-fertilization, etc. And the famous question, who is a Malay, what is a Malay, remains a moot point.
Okay. So we are going to take a short break.
Sure.
So when we come back, we'll discuss more about religious pluralism.
And the book that you published.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hello and welcome back to Durian ASEAN. You're with Gowri
And Arlene.
and still with Dr. Johan Saravanamuttu, who's here with us. And we're going to discuss more about religious pluralism and whether or not it can work in ASEAN. So,
Let's talk about your book.
your book.
Oh, my book.
It's a very thick book. You published it this year. It's called Religious Diversity in Muslim Majority States in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Well, let me make a correction. It's not my book. First, it is edited by my colleague, an expert, doctor, an expert on Indonesia. His name is Dr. Bernard Plasdash. He was also with me in the Institute of South Asian Studies at one point. And it is actually an edited volume. In other words, we were the editors. There are many contributors. How many chapters? I can't remember now. Indonesia has about 12 chapters, maybe 11, and Malaysia has 20, altogether 20 chapters. So it's people who study minorities, particularly within the Indonesian and Malaysian context. So, for example, there is an article about the, deals with Ahmadiyas or the Ahmadis, and that group that has been proscribed in Indonesia, or rather the religion is considered deviant, just like the Shias are considered deviant in Malaysia. So we have somebody called Nur Sharil writing about Shias in Malaysia. So and then of course we have on Malaysia we have Dr. Chong Yu Chung, writing about Christianity and the conflicts that have been occurring between Muslims and Christians.
Is he the one with Taylor? Chong Yu Chung?
Chong Yu Chung, Taylor, he's with Taylor, that's right. And there's also a piece on Buddhism, Buddhist engagement with in the Malaysian context. So looking at that kind of issue, of course, for Sabah and Sarawak, we have two persons writing. One, Pauline Bala, who's at UNIMAS, writing about the Kelabit and the Lumbawan. You know where they are from?
No.
I mean, they are in the northern part of Sarawak, actually.
Okay.
And Idris Jala, who is a minister of something.
Something.
In the Prime Minister's department. He's quite famous, right? He was the one
is.
that turned around Mas, or was supposed to turn around the Mas. He is actually a Kelabit. Yeah, so it's a very small minority within a very diverse Sarawak population, as you know. And then Bidayos, you have Ibans, who are the largest indigenous community in Sarawak. And then Bidayos are, I think, the next, if I'm not mistaken, community. Next largest indigenous community. There's Liana Chua, who works in teachers in UK, and she writes about the Bidayo. So these people have researched thoroughly. They're some of them anthropologists and so on, so they know a lot more about these communities than I do. I know very little, actually. So what we did was Bernard and I got together these different people who are
and
experts.
you compile all
and we
these
compiled
different
these
stories and
stories,
research.
Of course, we wrote the overall introductions to the different volumes. I mean, to the volume for each of the sections.
I'm interested with this book because you focus mainly on Muslim majority states within Southeast Asia. So when it comes to Malaysia and Indonesia, even though both of the countries are Muslim majority, but they have totally different experience and reaction and policies towards minority groups.
Different, but not totally different. You're right, and the whole sort of basis for engagement with minorities is different. For example, just take Indonesia, Malaysia, two the largest Muslim dominant countries in the region. Indonesia has a national ideology called Pancasila, So the Panchasila is actually an interesting concept. We have Rukun Nagara.
Which is a rip-off, isn't it?
You said it, not me. But on Panchasila, Panchasila is interesting because it recognizes it's actually recognition of diversity. So it was a concept that came with Indonesian independence, the Sukarno era, and so on. So Indonesia, as you know, there's Bali, which is Hindu. You know, it's a very diverse country, although it's 80% Muslim. So it recognizes the existence of all these religions. So in a way, it is multicultural, and there is an actual policy of multiculturalism with respect to religion. Malaysia, on the other hand, as we know, we are Malaysians, does not really have that policy.
Our constitution does not cover minority rights?
It does. It covers minority rights in that it's freedom of religion, you know, all the articles are there, individual liberties, etc. And we have that. But on the other hand, we have Article 3, right, that says that Islam is the religion of the Federation. So Malaysia does not have, it's different from Indonesia in that respect. So politically, there's already a recognition of Islam as the official religion of Malaysia.
I'm just curious, is it because Indonesia is a republic? Because being a republic meaning you cannot, like, you know, officially recognize just only one religion or one race. But Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy. So would that make a lot of difference in terms of how majority groups interact with minority groups?
Well taken, point taken. In Indonesia, but it's not just because it's a republic, but it did, as you say, move out of a feudal kind of a system, whereas Malaysia has maintained the trappings of I don't know whether the attack was calling it feudalism, trappings. So we do have the various sultans and rajas as heads of religion in each individual state. So that even is rather interesting. Although Islam is the religion of the Federation, in fact the sultans, not necessarily the governors of Penang and so on, but they still have their religious departments. Religion is a state matter. So there is that difference as well.
So even in Penang has their own religious issue that
you're pointing to
Penang,
Gowri as if she's responsible for it.
I know.
I'm also from Penang. Yeah, it has a religious authority as well. Majlis Agama, you know, just like you have Jawi, you know, etc. Each entity in Malaysia has this kind of because of this authority for Islam, but not for the other religions. The other religions are free-flowing, you know, religious, free-flowing religious entities. So they don't have a state kind of, sanction. That's the difference. Indonesia is similar in that sense, in that it's a Muslim majority country, but it doesn't have this kind of thing which says there is an official state religion.
I just want to ask you in the context of Malaysia, or just from an academician's point of view, when it comes to religious diversity or pluralism, can it have a negative effect on a country?
Pluralism as something that is
Do you think having a more homogeneous society would be better for a nation state?
But you know, you have heard of this very, very, what's the term for? I wanted to find an adjective. The term ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
A little bit disgusting, right? That you actually. It happened with a European state in Bosnia. That's when the term became very current. So you had now you look. I do mention Myanmar.
Yes.
You have Rohingyas, who are actually people who come from Bangladesh. So they have lived in the Arakan area for years and years, and they're simply not recognized as even. They're stateless. They're not even recognized as Burmese. A Burmese community. So what was happening in Bosnia and in Myanmar most recently was that this idea of ethnic cleansing was going on. Now it may not be a state policy, but in practice it becomes something like you want to eliminate a particular group from here. Because just to answer your question, I'm sorry Arlene, I have to finish the point. because you want to have this nation state, you want to have this cohesion of your nation state. I think it's misguided.
But even if you were to look at what happened with the Jews, when Hitler was saying that, oh, it's because of the Jews that, the Germans don't have opportunities when it comes to education, a job, so let's get rid of them.
And they're the ones who control the economy of Germany at the time.
What's with that ethnocentric ideology?
You said it. Control the economy. Same thing in Indonesia. There was a time when the Chinese are about 3% of the population or less, 3, and there was the same thing going on during the Reformasi. Some of it is exaggerated that Chinese were singled out to be massacred. In this at the first flush of the Reformasi, which turned out to be a good thing. Now you have a very vibrant democratic state in Indonesia. And I think the Chinese community in Indonesia are okay now. They're well protected. But fact of the matter is the Chinese in Indonesia did control not all of the economy, but a large chunk of the economy. I would say the same thing in Malaysia. I mean, if one were to be objective about it, the Chinese community is a very, very enterprising, etc. community. They do business very well. They have already all the the networking and so on. The Jews. That was the argument that Hitler was also making, or those who supported that fascist ideology, said that they were controlling the economy, and therefore they had to be got rid of. But that's only it's only a half truth. I mean, you might find, you're such a small minority. Yes, you can control the economy to some extent, but you're never able to really take full charge, as it is often stated to be the case.
I want to bring the conversation back to Myanmar because the Rohingya, they don't necessarily control the economy. In fact, they are probably at the very bottom rung in terms of social class strata. One thing interesting about them is the Myanmar government does create this state policy. It's actually just recently, it's called the Rakhine Plan, if I'm not mistaken, where they want to systematically get rid of or just put them in one area in a concentration camp. My just curiosity on this is why governments in Southeast Asia can be Muslim, can be atheist, or can be Buddhist, they tend to justify certain action of the government through religion or through certain spiritual ideology.
I'm trying to understand why, say in the Rakhine state, because I have some friends who are in Institute of Southeast Asians who are actually very, very erudite scholars, and when I ask them the question about the Rakhine and the Rohingyas, they these are, I wouldn't name anybody, but these are people who are experts on Burma. They are Burmese themselves. They say that they have never been recognized as citizens. So there is something about citizenship, which is sometimes an issue that crops up even in Malaysia, right? I don't know whether it's a religious factor. It is often that we are the original citizens of, we are the rightful.
It's an identity factor.
Bumi Putra idea lah, we are the Bumi Putra. These people are not really, Burmese, that kind of idea.
And they're trying to term them as the Bengalis.
Exactly. Some of it is true. I mean, it's not that they're not true. So because of the conditions in Bangladesh being so, dire and so on, these people cross over. It's happened everywhere in the world. Communities who are at the borders are usually the ones, as you say, the most economically, oppressed, in the worst situation, and yet they are the ones that are most badly treated by the state, because the state wants to guard its borders. It's a nation-state problem.
Is it really also a problem of identity? It wants to create this one identity, and it feels that that particular community doesn't fit into that identity. That
too, and also for economic reasons, and for reasons that they will disrupt things, make security questions. There's also a security. A lot of it. Burma, is actually very complex. If you look at the minorities. So Rohingyas is just one major group. But there's the Shans, the Karens, the this and that, and this and that. There's so many communities. And there is a political scientist by the name of Tedgar who studied Burma, or gave Burma as an example of the country with the most serious minority problems in the world, despite the fact that it is a very dominant Buddhist society. You have all these in the periphery, these different groups, who actually have their own armies, some of them. So you see, there's a security question. So I think you go back to this thing of Rohingyas. They're afraid that it would also spiral into something that becomes problematic for
a separatist group, you mean?
Could be in a separate state. We have something in Thailand too, right? A separatist Muslim group. Now,
would that be the same with in Indonesia, for example, Papua? Because it seems like Papua is the odd one out compared to the rest of Indonesia.
Yes, exactly. So you have these minorities which are usually at the border, and because they have the territorial presence, they become, quote unquote, a problem for the nation state. But what is the solution? The solution, I think, or rather, maybe we'll never find solutions for social problems like in mathematics, right? But at least there are ways of managing them. I think the nation state is not entirely obsolete yet. It still has the capacity.
We have the Canada model, maybe.
Canada model is good. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. A lot of people criticize Canada as well.
Why are you pointing Canada? Okay.
So you have this, I think, the national unit to institute laws and regulations and best practice. But I think the idea that, go back to your original idea, you also need the supranational unit, your ASEAN, to create certain norms and values which are more universal. So you try and bring these larger universal values to bear on what is practiced within nation state. For example, for a long time, ASEAN would not even have Burma or Myanmar. I keep calling it Burma. I'm from the 70s. Myanmar to even be chairman of ASEAN, chairperson of ASEAN, because it's quote unquote it is not a democratic state. Most of ASEAN countries are not democratic states anyway. So now you have Thailand, which is a military run state. So they use that against Myanmar to sort of say we cannot accept Myanmar yet because it hasn't accepted ASEAN norms. So for the same reason, you use it positively, think of it positively, ASEAN norms. Recently, ASEAN declared in 2012 that we are now practicing universal human rights, right? There's an ASEAN Accord on human rights. So why don't we use that kind of umbrella of human rights practices and bring it to bear in all these ASEAN countries and make sure they follow some of these best practices.
And now with the ASEAN integration, actually, can the other countries actually come together and help out this, like for example Myanmar or even Thailand with these issues that they're facing?
Yeah, I think the right word would be, do they even have the political will to do that? Because you're talking about ASEAN economic community, you're liberalizing the economy, the mobilization, the mobility of people and goods and services. Are they even having the guts to address this problem?
Very critical. The so-called socio-cultural community. We are supposed to create, ASEAN, all very grand ideas, right? Political community, economic community. After, I suppose, to be 2015 next year. How much of it is going to be true, I don't know. And then the social cultural one is the toughest one, I think, because it is in fact never going to be a cohesive social cultural community. But at least I think you can say we introduce certain practices which are universally accepted. I think that's what we can aspire to for the moment. It takes I'm not saying that we should become like European Union, but it'll be a very long time before even the European Union is struggling with so-called European values. But they're closer to that ideal, of accepting a kind of spirit of European, Europeanness. So we can come around to accepting an idea of Southeast Asianness or ASEAN-ness in time to come, I suppose. That's the best we can hope for.
I think it's very interesting because we always try to market ourselves globally by saying like, oh, look at all this diversity that we have, different religion, different people. But at the same time, when you go down to the grassroots, we are not contented with that, right? We, like you said earlier, we are like, oh, we're the originals. This is our country. These people are not really. And that's kind of hypocritical in a way.
But
as
it's nothing
well.
wrong, right? I mean, you feel more Penang than I feel more KLite. Just give an example. There's nothing wrong to be different or to feel different. But what's right is to create an equal platform to everyone. To be respected for your differences.
Yeah, and some of it may have to come down to even fixing rules and regulations. So, you say this Penang one is a good example. Penang people, yes, fine. But Penang people also get out of Penang, right? So they also have to be subject to KL rules and
KL
regulations.
people kind of push you aside.
Yeah,
like, oh,
push
you're not
you
really
aside.
from here.
Yeah. So there has to be some kind of, an overall kind of acceptance of it. But at the same time, you want to preserve a Penangness, right? You want your char kway teow, you want your laksa.
Not made by foreigners.
And you don't want it to be too diluted. You don't want foreign cooks to cook them. Like Lim Guan Eng says. So there's something that you will preserve. But that's through what is called best practices. You carry on, but you do not do harm to other people by doing these things. You maintain a certain level of civility.
So you employ the foreigners.
So, in your opinion, Doctor, before we wrap things up,
Yeah.
what is the way forward for us to preserve all this religious
Tolerance.
plurality?
I had in my
mouthful.
notes, now finally asking me a question. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, I think there has to be increasingly in our very, very conflictual world when it comes to religion and cultural rights, we have to have some mechanism for interfaith relationships. I know we tried one in Malaysia and failed miserably, Interfaith Commission, but I think it is necessary. For example, this book, again I'm plugging the book, says that the levels of intolerance and areas of toleration is actually are getting quite bad in both Indonesia and Malaysia. It doesn't, although the nice thing about how things are moving is that there are many groups, you are examples of it, who are trying to sort of understand these problems and mediate. So the civil society groups, NGOs and so on are doing that. So I think the way forward is to create these kinds of spaces in the public sphere, interfaith relationships, NGOs, civil society, to engage, even if it starts small, to keep people sort of engaged and to keep people civil about these things. Yeah.
So, Durian ASEAN is a good start.
Excellent. Congratulations for starting it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us
You're
in
welcome.
our discussion this morning.